Book 3, Chapter 1. One of Ambrose Merrick's favorite books was A Railway Timetable. He spent many hours in studying these intricate pages of figures, noting times of arrival and departure on a piece of paper, and following the turnings and intersections of certain lines on the map. In this way he had at last arrived at the best and quickest route to his native country, which he had not seen for 5 years. His father had died when he was 10 years old. This result once obtained, the 7:30 to Birmingham got him in at 9:35. The 10:20 for the West was a capital train, and he would see the great dome of Mynydde Mawr before 1 o'clock. His fancy led him often to a bridge which crossed the railway about a mile out of Lupton. East and west the meadows stretched in a straight line, defying, it seemed, the wisdom of Euclid. He turned from the east and gazed westward, and when a red train went by in the right direction, he would lean over the bridge and watch till the last flying carriage had vanished into the distance. He imagined himself in that train, and thought of the joy of it, if the time ever came, for it seemed long, the joy in every revolution of the wheels, in every whistle of the engine, in the rush and in the rhythm of this swift flight from that horrible school, in that horrible place. Year after year went by, and he had not revisited the old land of his father. He was left alone in the great empty house, in charge of the servants during the holidays, except one summer when Mr. Horbury despatched him to a cousin of his who lived in Yarmouth. The second year after his father's death there was a summer of dreadful heat. Day after day the sky was a glare of fire, and in these abhorred Midlands, far from the breath of the sea and the mountain breeze, the ground baked and cracked and stank to heaven. A dun smoke rose from the earth with the faint sickening stench of a brick-field, and the hedgerows swooned in the heat and in the dust. Ambrose's body and soul were athirst with the desire of the hills and the woods. His heart cried out within him for the water-pools in the shadow of the forest, and in his ears continually he heard the cold water pouring and trickling and dripping from the grey rocks on the great mountain side. And he saw that awful land, which God has no doubt made for manufacturers to prepare them for their eternal habitation, its weary waves burning under the glaring sky, the factory chimneys of Lupton vomiting their foul smoke, the mean red streets, each little hellway with its own stink, the dull road choking in its dust. For streams there was the Wand, running like black oil between black banks, steaming here as boiling poisons were belched into it from the factory wall, there glittering with iridescent scum vomited from some other scoundrel's castle. And for the water-pools of the woods he was free to gaze at the dark green liquor in the tanks of the sulphuric acid factory. But a little way out of town Lupton was a very rising place. His body was faint with the burning heat and the foulness of all about him, and his soul was sick with loneliness and friendlessness and unutterable longing. He had already mastered his Bradshaw and had found out the bridge over the railway, and day after day he leaned over the parapet and watched the burning metals vanishing into the west, into the hot, thick haze that hung over all the land. And the trains sped away towards the haven of his desire, and he wondered if he should ever see again the dearly loved country, or hear the song of the nightingale in the still white morning, in the circle of the green hills. The thought of his father, of the old days of happiness, of the grey home in the still valley, swelled in his heart, and he wept bitterly. So utterly forsaken and wretched seemed his life. It happened towards the end of that dreadful August that one night he had tossed all through the hours listening to the chiming bells, only falling into a fevered doze a little while before they called him. He woke from ugly and oppressive dreams to utter wretchedness. He crawled downstairs like an old man, and left his breakfast untouched, for he could eat nothing. The flame of the sun seemed to burn in his brain. The hot smoke of the air choked him. All his limbs ached. From head to foot he was a body of suffering. He struggled out and tottered along the road to the bridge, and gazed with dim, hopeless eyes along the path of desire into the heavy, burning mist in the far distance. And then his heart beat quick, and he cried aloud in his amazed delight, for in the shimmering glamour of the haze he saw, as in a mirror, the vast green wall of the great mountain rise before him, not far, but as if close at hand. Nay, he stood upon its slope. His feet were in the sweet-smelling bracken. The hazel thicket was rustling beneath him in the brave wind, and the shining water poured cold from the stony rock. He heard the silver note of the lark, shrilling high and glad in the sunlight. He saw the yellow blossoms tossed by the breeze about the porch of the white house. He seemed to turn in this vision, and before him the dear, long-remembered land appeared in its great peace and beauty. Meadows and cornfield, hill and valley, and deep wood between the mountains and the far sea. He drew a long breath of that quickening and glorious air, and knew that life had returned to him. And then he was gazing once more down the glittering railway into the mist, but strength and hope had replaced that deadly sickness of a moment before, and light and joy came back to his eyes. The vision had doubtless been given to him in a sore and pressing need. It returned no more. Not again did he see the fair height of Mynydd Mawr rise out of the mist. But from that day the station on the bridge was daily consecrated. It was his place of refreshment and hope in many seasons of evil and weariness. From this place he could look forward to the hour of release and return that must come at last. Here he could remind himself that the bonds of the flesh had been broken in a wonderful manner, that he had been set free from the jaws of hell and death. Fortunately, few people came that way. It was but a by-road, serving a few farms in the neighborhood, and on the Sunday afternoon, in November, the head's sermon over and dinner eaten, he betook himself to his tower, free to be alone for a couple of hours at least. He stood there, leaning on the wall, his face turned, as ever, to the west, and, as it were, a great flood of rapture overwhelmed him. He sank down, deeper, still deeper, into the hidden and marvelous places of delight. In his country there were stories of the magic people who rose all gleaming from the pools in lonely woods, who gave more than mortal bliss to those who loved them, who could tell the secrets of that land where flame was the most material substance, whose inhabitants dwelt in palpitating and quivering colors, or in the notes of a wonderful melody. And in the dark of the night all legends had been fulfilled. It was a strange thing, but Ambrose Merrick, though he was a public schoolboy of 15, had lived all his days in a rapt innocence. It is possible that in school, as elsewhere, enlightenment, pleasant or unpleasant, only comes to those who seek for it. Or one may say certainly that there are those who dwell under the protection of enchantments, who may go down into the black depths, and yet appear resurgent and shining, without any stain or defilement of the pitch on their white robes. For these have ears so intent on certain immortal songs that they cannot hear discordant voices. Their eyes are veiled with a light that shuts out the vision of evil. There are flames about these feet that extinguish the gross fires of the pit. It is probable that all through those early years Ambrose's father had been charming his son's heart, drawing him forth from the Gehenna valley of this life into which he had fallen, as one draws forth a beast that has fallen into some deep and dreadful place. Various are the methods recommended. There is the way of what is called moral teaching, the way of physiology, and the way of a masterly silence. But Mr. Merrick's was the strange way of incantation. He had, in a certain manner, drawn the boy aside from the evil traffic of the valley, from the stench of the turmoil, from the blows and the black lechery, from the ugly fight in the poisonous smoke, from all the amazing and hideous folly that practical men call life, and had set him in that endless procession that forever and forever sings its litanies in the mountains, going from height to height on its great quest. Ambrose's soul had been caught in the sweet thickets of the woods. It had been bathed in the pure water of blessed fountains. It had knelt before the altars of the old saints, till the earth was become a sanctuary. All life was a rite and ceremony, the end of which was the attainment of the mystic sanctity, the achieving of the Grail. For this, for what else, were all things made. It was this that the little bird sang of in the bush, piping a few feeble, plaintive notes of dusky evenings, as if its tiny heart were sad that it could utter nothing better than such sorry praises. This also celebrated the awe of the white morning on the hills, the breath of the woods at dawn. This was figured in the red ceremony of sunset, when flames shone over the dome of the great mountain, and roses blossomed in the far plains of the sky. This was the secret of the dark places and the heart of the woods. This the mystery of the sunlight on the height, and every little flower, every delicate fern, and every reed and rush was entrusted with the hidden declaration of this sacrament. For this end, final and perfect rites had been given to men to execute, and these were all the arts, all the far-lifted splendor of the great cathedral, all rich carven work and all glowing colors, all magical utterance of word and tones. All these things were the witnesses that consented in the one offering, in the high service of the Grail. To this service also, together with songs and burning torches and dyed garments and the smoke of the bruised incense, were brought the incense of the bruised heart, the magic torches of virtue hidden from the world, the red dalmatics of those whose souls had been martyred, the songs of triumph and exultation chanted by them that the profane had crushed into the dust. Holy wells and water stoups were fountains of tears. So must the Mass be duly celebrated in Cor-arbennic, when Cadwaladr returned, when Tylo Agios lifted up again the shining cup. Perhaps it was not strange that a boy who had listened to such spells as these should heed nothing of the foolish evils about him, the nastiness of silly children who, for want of wits, were crushing the lilies into the dunghill. He listened to nothing of their ugly folly. He heard it not, understood it not, thought as little of it as of their everlasting chatter about brooks and quarries and leg-hits and beaks from the off. And when an unseemly phrase did chance to fall on his ear, it was of no more import or meaning than any or all of the stupid jargon that went on day after day, mixing itself with the other jargon about the optative and the past participle, the oratio obliqua, and the verbs in, Greek me. To him this was all one nothingness, and he would not have dreamed of connecting anything of it with the facts of life, as he understood life. Hence it was that for him all that was beautiful and wonderful was a part of sanctity. All the glory of life was for the service of the sanctuary, and when one saw a lovely flower, it was to be strewn before the altar, just as the bee was holy because by its wax the gifts are illuminated. Where joy and delight and beauty were, there he knew by sure signs were the parts of the mystery, the glorious apparels of the heavenly vestments. If anyone had told him that the song of the nightingale was an unclean thing, he would have stared in amazement, as though one had blasphemed the Sanctus. To him the red roses were as holy as the garments of the martyrs. The white lilies were pure and shining virtues. The imagery of the Song of Songs was obvious and perfect and unassailable, for in this world there was nothing more common nor unclean. And even to him the great gift had been freely given. So he stood, wrapped in his meditations and in his ecstasy, by the bridge over the Midland line from Lupton to Birmingham. Behind him were the abominations of Lupton, the chimneys vomiting black smoke faintly in honor of the Sabbath, the red lines of the workmen's streets advancing into the ugly fields, the fuming pottery kilns, the hideous height of the boot factory, and before him stretched the unspeakable scenery of the eastern Midlands, which seems made for the habitation of English nonconformists, dull, monotonous, squalid, the very hedgerows cropped and trimmed, the trees looking like the rows of Roundheads, the farmhouses as uninteresting as suburban villas. On a field near at hand, a scientific farmer had recently applied an agreeable mixture consisting of superphosphate of lime, nitrate of soda, and bone meal. The stink was that of a chemical works or a Texel cheese. Another field was just being converted into an orchard. There were rows of grim young apple trees planted at strictly mathematical intervals from one another, and grisly little graves had been dug between the apple trees for the reception of gooseberry bushes. Between these rows the farmer hoped to grow potatoes, so the ground had been thoroughly trenched. It looked sodden and unpleasant. To the right, Ambrose could see how the operations on a wandering brook were progressing. It had moved in and out in the most wasteful and absurd manner, and on each bank there had grown a twisted brake of trees and bushes and rank water plants. There were wonderful red roses there in summer-time. Now all this was being rectified. In the first place, the stream had been cut into a straight channel with raw bare banks, and then the rose bushes, the alders, the willows, and the rest were being grubbed up by the roots, and so much valuable land was being redeemed. The old barn, which used to be visible on the left of the line, had been pulled down for more than a year. It had dated, perhaps, from the 17th century. Its roof tree had dipped and waved in a pleasant fashion, and the red tiles had the glow of the sun in their colors, and the half-timbered walls were not lacking in ruinous brace. It was a dilapidated old shed, and a neat-looking structure with a corrugated iron roof now stood in its place. Beyond all was the grey prison wall of the horizon, but Ambrose no longer gazed at it with the dim, hopeless eyes of old. He had a breviary among his books, and he thought of the words, Anima mea erepta est sicut passer de laqueo venantium, and he knew that in a good season his body would escape also. The exile would end at last. He remembered an old tale which his father was fond of telling him, the story of Eos Amirador, the Emperor Nightingale. Very long ago, the story began, the greatest and the finest court in all the realms of Faery was the court of Emperor Eos, who was above all the kings of the Tylwyth Teg, as the Emperor of Rome is head over all the kings of the earth. So that even Gwynap Nuth, whom they now call lord over all the fair folk of the Isle of Britain, was but the man of Eos, and no splendor such as his was ever seen in all the regions of enchantment and faery. Eos had his court in a vast forest called Wentwood, in the deepest depths of the greenwood between Caerwent and Caermain, which is also called the City of the Legions, though some men say that we should rather name it the City of the Waterfloods. Here, then, was the palace of Eos, built of the finest stones after the Roman manner, and within it were the most glorious chambers that eyes ever seen, and there was no end to the number of them, for they could not be counted. For the stones of the palace being immortal, they were at the pleasure of the emperor. If he had willed, all the hosts of the world could stand in his greatest hall, and, if he had willed, not so much as an ant could enter into it, since it could not be discerned. But on common days they spread the emperor's banquet in 9 great halls, each 9 times larger than any that are in the lands of the men of Normandy. And Circa was the seneschal who marshalled the feast, and if you would count those under his command, go count the drops of water that are in the Usk river. But if you would learn the splendor of this castle, it is an easy matter, for Eos hung the walls of it with dawn and sunset. He lit it with the sun and moon. There was a well in it called Ocean, and 9 churches of twisted boughs were set apart in which Eos might hear mass. And when his clerks sang before him, all the jewels rose shining out of the earth, and all the stars bent shining down from heaven. So enchanting was the melody. Then was great bliss in all the regions of the fair folk. But Eos was grieved because mortal ears could not hear nor comprehend the enchantment of their song. What, then, did he do? Nothing less than this. He divested himself of all his glories and of his kingdom, and transformed himself into the shape of a little brown bird, and went flying about the woods, desirous of teaching men the sweetness of the fairy melody. And all the other birds said, "This is a contemptible stranger." The eagle found him not even worthy to be a prey. The raven and the magpie called him simpleton. The pheasant asked where he had got that ugly livery. The lark wondered why he hid himself in the darkness of the wood. The peacock would not suffer his name to be uttered. In short, never was anyone so despised as was Eos by all the chorus of the birds. But wise men heard that song from the fairy regions, and listened all night beneath the bough, and these were the first who were bards in the Isle of Britain. Ambrose had heard the song from the fairy regions. He had heard it in swift whispers at his ear, in sighs upon his breast, in the breath of kisses on his lips. Never was he numbered amongst the despisers of Eos. Chapter 2. Mr. Horbury had suffered from 1 or 2 slight twinges of conscience for a few days after he had operated on his nephew. They were but very slight pangs, for, after all, it was a case of flagrant and repeated disobedience to rules, complicated by lying. The high usher was quite sincere in scouting the notion of the boys taking any interest in Norman architecture, and, as he said to himself, truly enough, if every boy at Lupton could come and go when and how he pleased, and choose which rules he would keep and which disobey, why, the school would soon be in a pretty state. Still, there was a very faint and indistinct murmur in his mind, which suggested that Merrick had received, in addition to his own proper thrashing, the thrashings due to the head, his cook, and his wine merchant. And Horbury was rather sorry, for he desired to be just according to his definition of justice, unless, indeed, justice should be excessively inconvenient. But these faint scruples were soon removed, turned, indeed, to satisfaction by the evident improvement which declared itself in Ambrose Merrick's whole tone and demeanour. He no longer did his best to avoid Rocker. He played, and played well, and with relish. The boy was evidently all right at heart. He had only wanted a sharp lesson, and it was clear that, once a loafer, he was now on his way to be a credit to the school. And by some of those secret channels which are known to masters, and to masters alone, rather more than a glimmering of the truth as to Rawson's black eyes and Pelly's disfigured nose was vouchsafed to Horbury's vision, and he was by no means displeased with his nephew. The 2 boys had evidently asked for punishment, and had got it. It served them right. Of course, if the swearing had been brought to his notice by official instead of by subterranean and mystic ways, he would have had to cane Merrick a second time, since, by the public school convention, an oath is a very serious offence, as bad as smoking, or worse. But, being far from a fool, under the circumstances, he made nothing of it. Then the lad's schoolwork was so very satisfactory. It had always been good, but it had become wonderfully good. That last Greek prose had shown real grip of the language. The high usher was pleased. His sharp lesson had brought forth excellent results, and he foresaw the day when he would be proud of having taught a remarkably fine scholar. With the boys, Ambrose was becoming a general favorite. He learned not only to play rocker, he showed Pelly how he thought that blow under the ear should be dealt with. They all said he was a good fellow, but they could not make out why, without apparent reason, he would sometimes burst out into loud laughter. But he said it was something wrong with his inside. The doctors couldn't make it out, and this seemed rather interesting. In afterlife, he often looked back upon this period when, to all appearance, Lupton was making a man of him, and wondered at its strangeness. To boys and masters alike, he was an absolutely normal schoolboy, busy with the same interests as the rest of them. There was certainly something rather queer in his appearance, but, as they said, generously enough, a fellow couldn't help his looks, and that curious glint in his eyes apart, he seemed as good a Luptonian as any in the whole 600. Everybody thought that he had absolutely fallen into line, that he was absorbing the ethos of the place in the most admirable fashion, subduing his own individuality, his opinions, his habits, to the general tone of the community around him, putting off, as it were, the profane dust of his own spirit, and putting on the mental frock of the brotherhood. This, of course, is one of the aims, rather the great aim, of the system. This fashioning of very diverse characters into one common form, so that each great public school has its type, which is so easily recognizable in the grown-up man years after his school days are over. Thus, in far lands, in India and Egypt, in Canada and New Zealand, one recognizes the brisk alertness of the Etonian, the exquisite politeness of Harrow, the profound seriousness of Rugby, while the note of Lupton may, perhaps, be called finality. The old Luptonian no more thinks of arguing a question than does the Holy Father, and his conversation is a series of irreformable dogmas, and the captious person who questions any one article is made to feel himself a cad and an outsider. Thus it has been related that two men who had met for the first time at a certain country house party were getting on together capitally in the evening over their whiskey and soda and cigars. Each held identical views with equal violence on some important topic, Home Rule, or the Transvaal, or Free Trade, and as the more masterful of the two asserted that hanging was too good for blank, naming a well-known statesman, the other would reply, "I quite agree with you. Hanging is too good for blank." "He ought to be burned alive," said the one. "That's about it. He ought to be burned at the stake," answered the other. "Look at the way he treated Dash. He's a coward and a damned scoundrel." "Perfectly right. He's a damned cursed scoundrel." This was splendid, and each thought the other a charming companion. Unfortunately, however, the conversation, by some caprice, veered from the iniquities of blank and glanced aside to cookery, possibly by the track of Irish stew, used metaphorically to express the disastrous and iniquitous policy of the great statesman with regard to Ireland. But, as it happened, there was not the same coincidence on the question of cookery as there had been on the question of blank. The masterful man said, "No cookery like English. No other race in the world can cook as we do. Look at French cookery. A lot of filthy, greasy messes." Now, instead of assenting briskly and firmly as before, the other man said, "Been much in France? Lived there?" "Never set foot in the beastly country. Don't like their ways, and don't care to dine off snails and frogs swimming in oil." The other man began then to talk off the simple but excellent meals he had relished in France, the savory croûte au pot and bouillie, good eating when flavored by a gherkin or two, velvety épinards au jus, a roast partridge, a salad, a bit of Roquefort, and a bunch of grapes. But he had barely mentioned the soup when the masterful one wheeled round his chair and offered a fine view of his strong, well-knit figure, as seen from the back. He did not say anything. He simply took up the paper and went on smoking. The other man stared in amazement. The amateur of French cookery looked annoyed, but the host, a keen-eyed old fellow with a white moustache, turned to the enemy of frogs and snails and grease, and said quite simply, "I say, Mullock, I never knew you'd been at Lupton." Mullock gazed. The other men held their breath for a moment as the full force of the situation dawned on them, and then a wild scream of laughter shrilled from their throats. Yells and roars of mirth resounded in the room. Their delight was insatiable. It died for a moment for lack of breath, and then burst out anew in still louder, more uproarious clamour, till old Sir Henry Rawnsley, who was fat and short, could do nothing but choke and gasp and crow out a sound something between a wheeze and a chuckle. Mullock left the room immediately, and the house the next morning. He made some excuse to his host, but he told inquiring friends, personally, he disliked bounders. The story, true or false, illustrates the common view of the Lupton stamp. "We try to teach the boys to know their own minds," said the headmaster, and the endeavour seems to have succeeded in most cases. And, as Horbury noted in an article he once wrote on the public school system, every boy was expected to submit himself to the process, to form and reform himself in accordance with the tone of the school. "I sometimes compare our work with that of the metal founder," he says in the article in question, "just as the metal comes to the foundry rudis indigestica mole, a rough and formless mass, without the slightest suggestion of the shape which it must finally assume. So a boy comes to a great public school with little or nothing about him to suggest the young man who, in 8 or 9 years' time, will say good-bye to the dear old school, setting his teeth tight, restraining himself from giving up to the anguish of this last farewell. Nay, I think that ours is the harder task, for the metal that is sent to the foundry has, I presume, been freed of its impurities. We have to deal rather with the ore, a mass which is not only shapeless, but contains much that is not metal at all, which must be burnt out and cast aside as useless rubbish. So the boy comes from his home, which may or may not have possessed valuable formative influences, which we often find has tended to create a spirit of individualism and assertiveness, which, in numerous cases, has left the boy under the delusion that he has come into the world to live his own life and think his own thoughts. This is the ore that we cast into our furnace. We burn out the dross and rubbish. We liquefy the stubborn and resisting metal till it can be run into the mould. The mould being the whole tone and feeling of a great community. We discourage all excessive individuality. We make it quite plain to the boy that he has come to Lupton not to live his life, not to think his thoughts, but to live our life, to think our thoughts. Very often, as I think I need scarcely say, the process is a somewhat unpleasant one, but sooner or later the stubbornest metal yields to the cleansing, renewing, restoring fires of discipline and public opinion, and the shapeless mass takes on the shape of the great school. Only the other day an old pupil came to see me and confessed that, for the whole of his first year at Lupton, he had been profoundly wretched. "I was a dreamy young fool," he said. "My head was stuffed with all sorts of queer fancies, and I expect that if I hadn't come to Lupton, I should have turned out an absolute loafer. But I hated it badly that first year. I loathed Rocker, I did really, and I thought the fellows were a lot of savages. And then I seemed to get into a kind of cloud. You see, sir, I was losing my old self and hadn't got the new self in its place, and I couldn't make out what was happening. And then, quite suddenly, it all came out light and clear. I saw the purpose behind it all, how we were all working together, masters and boys, for the dear old school, how we were all members one of another, as the doctor said in chapel, and that I had a part in this great work too, though I was only a kid in the third. It was like a flash of light. One minute I was only a poor little chap that nobody cared for and who didn't matter to anybody, and the next I saw that, in a way, I was as important as the doctor himself. I was part of the failure or success of it all. Do you know what I did, sir? I had a book I thought a lot of, Poems and Tales of Edgar Allan Poe. It was my poor sister's book. She had died a year before, when she was only 17, and she had written my name in it when she was dying. She knew I was fond of reading it. It was just the sort of thing I used to like, morbid fancies and queer poems, and I was always reading it when the fellows would let me alone. But when I saw what life really was, when the meaning of it all came to me, as I said just now, I took that book and tore it to bits, and it was like tearing myself up. But I knew that writing all that stuff hadn't done that American fellow much good, and I didn't see what good I should get by reading it. I couldn't make out to myself that it would fit in with the doctor's plans of the spirit of the school, or that I should play up at rocker any better for knowing all about the fall of the House of Usher, or whatever it's called. I knew my poor sister would understand, so I tore it up, and I've gone straight ahead ever since, thanks to Lupton. Like a refiner's fire, I remembered the dreamy, absent-minded child of 15 years before. I could scarcely believe that he stood before, keen, alert, practical, living every moment of his life, a force, a power in the world, certain of successful achievement. Such were the influences to which Ambrose Merrick was being subjected, and with infinite success, as it seemed to everybody who watched him. He was regarded as a conspicuous instance of the efficacy of the system. He had held out so long, refusing to absorb the tone, presenting an obstinate surface to the millstone which would, for his own good, have ground him to powder, not concealing very much his dislike of the place and of the people in it. And suddenly he had submitted with a good grace. It was wonderful. The masters are believed to have discussed the affair amongst themselves, and Horbury, who confessed or boasted that he had used sharp persuasion, got a good deal of kudos in consequence. Chapter 3. A few years ago, a little book called Half-Holidays attracted some attention in semi-scholastic, semi-clerical circles. It was anonymous, and bore the modest title Cramba Biscocta, but those behind the scenes recognized it as the work of Charles Palmer, who was for many years a master at Lupton. His acknowledged books include a useful little work on the accents, and an excellent summary of Roman history from the fall of the Republic to Romulus Augustulus. The Half-Holidays contains the following amusing passage. There is not much difficulty in identifying the N mentioned in it with Ambrose Merrick. The cleverest dominie sometimes discovers, the passage begins, that he has been living in a fool's paradise, that he has been tricked by a quiet and persistent subtlety that really strikes one as almost devilish when one finds it exhibited in the person of an English schoolboy. A good deal of nonsense, I think, has been written about boys by people who in reality know very little about them. They have been credited with complexities of character, with feelings and aspirations and delicacies of sentiment which are quite foreign to their nature. I can quite believe in the dead cat trick of Stalky and his friends, but I confess that the incident of the British flag leaves me cold and sceptical. Such refinement of perception is not the way of the boy, certainly not of the boy as I have known him. He is radically a simple soul, whose feelings are on the surface, and his deepest laid schemes and maneuvers hardly call for the talents of a Sherlock Holmes if they are to be detected and brought to naught. Of course, a good deal of rubbish has been talked about the wonderful success of our English plan of leaving the boys to themselves without the everlasting supervision which is practiced in French schools. As a matter of fact, the English schoolboy is under constant supervision, where in a French school one wretched usher has to look after a whole bunch of boys. In an English school, each boy is perpetually under the observation of hundreds of his fellows. In reality, Each boy is an unpaid peon, a watchdog whose vigilance never relaxes. He is not aware of this. One need scarcely say that such a notion is far from his wildest thoughts. He thinks, and very rightly, doubtless, that he is engaged in maintaining the honor of the school, in keeping up the observance of the school tradition, in dealing sharply with slackers and loafers who would bring discredit on the place he loves so well. He is, no doubt, absolutely right in all this. Nonetheless, he is doing the master's work unwittingly and admirably. When one thinks of this, and of the compulsory system of games, which ensures that every boy shall be in a certain place at a certain time, one sees, I think, that the phrase about our lack of supervision is a phrase and nothing more. There is no system of supervision known to human wit that approaches in thoroughness and minuteness the supervision under which every single boy is kept all through his life at an English public school. Hence one is really rather surprised when, in spite of all these unpaid assistants, who are the whole school, one is thoroughly and completely taken in. I can only remember one such case, and I am still astonished at the really infernal ability with which the boy in question lived a double life under the very eyes of the masters and 600 other boys. N, as I shall call him, was not in my house, and I can scarcely say how I came to watch his career with so much interest. But there was certainly something about him which did interest me a good deal. It may have been his appearance. He was an odd-looking boy, dark, almost swarthy, dreamy and absent in manner, and, for the first years of his school life, a quite typical loafer. Such boys, of course, are not common in a big school, but there are a few such everywhere. One never knows whether this kind will write a successful book, or paint a great picture, or go to the devil. From my observation, I am sorry to say that the last career is the most usual. I need scarcely say that such boys meet with but little encouragement. It is not the type which the public school exists to foster. And the boy who abandons himself to morbid introspection is soon made to feel pretty emphatically that he is matter in the wrong place. Of course, one may be crushing genius. If this ever happened, it would be very unfortunate. Still, in all communities, the minority must suffer for the good of the majority, and, frankly, I have always been willing to run the risk. As I have hinted, the particular sort of boy I have in my mind turns out, in 9 cases out of 10, to be not a genius, but that much more common type, a blackguard. Well, as I say, I was curious about N. I was sorry for him, too. Both his parents were dead, and he was rather in the position of the poor fellows who have no home life to look forward to when the holidays are getting near. And his obstinacy astonished me. In most cases, the pressure of public opinion will bring the slackest loafer to a sense of the error of his ways before his first term is ended. But N seemed to hold out against us all with a sort of dreamy resistance that was most exasperating. I do not think he can have had a very pleasant time. His general demeanor suggested that of a sage who has been cast on an island inhabited by a peculiarly repulsive and degraded tribe of savages, and I need scarcely say that the other boys did their best to make him realize the extreme absurdity of such behavior. He was clever enough at his work, but it was difficult to make him play games, and impossible to make him play up. He seemed to be looking through us at something else, and neither the boys nor the masters liked being treated as unimportant illusions. And then, quite suddenly, N altered completely. I believe his housemaster, worn out of all patience, gave him a severe thrashing. At any rate, the change was instant and marvelous. I remember that for a few days before N's transformation, we had been discussing the question of the cane at the weekly masters' meeting. I had confessed myself a very half-hearted believer in the efficacy of the treatment. I forgot the arguments that I used, but I know that I was strongly inclined to favor the anti-baculist party, as the head jocosely named it. But a few months later, when N's housemaster pointed out N playing up at football like a young demon, and then, with a twinkle in his eye, reminded me of the position I had taken up at the master's meeting, there was nothing for it but to own that I had been in the wrong. The cane had certainly, in this case, proved itself a magic wand. The sometime loafer had been transformed by it into one of the healthiest and most energetic fellows in the whole school. It was a pleasure to watch him at the games, and I remember that his fast bowling was at once terrific in speed and peculiarly deadly in its accuracy. He kept up this deception, for deception it was, for 3 or 4 years. He was just going up to Oxford, and the whole school was looking forward to a career which we knew would be quite exceptional in its brilliance. His scholarship papers astonished the Balliol authorities. I remember one of the fellows writing to our head about them in terms of the greatest enthusiasm, and we all knew that N's bowling game would get him into the University 11 in his first term. Cricketers have not yet forgotten a certain performance of his at the Oval, when, as a poetic journalist observed, wickets fell before him as ripe corn falls before the sickle. N disappeared in the middle of the term. The whole school was in a ferment. Masters and boys looked at one another with wild faces. Search parties were sent out to scour the country. The police were communicated with. On every side one heard the strangest surmises as to what had happened. The affair got into the papers. Most people thought it was a case of breakdown and loss of memory from overwork and mental strain. Nothing could be heard of N till, at the end of a fortnight, his housemaster came into our room, looking, as I thought, puzzled and frightened. "I don't understand," he said. "I've had this by the second post. It's in N's handwriting. I can't make head or tail of it. It's some sort of French, I suppose." He held out a paper closely written in N's exquisite, curious script, which always reminded me vaguely of some Oriental character. The masters shook their heads as the manuscript went from hand to hand, and one of them suggested sending for the French master. But, as it happened, I was something of a student of Old French myself, and I found I could make out the drift of the document that N had sent his master. It was written in the manner and in the language of Rabelais. It was quite diabolically clever, and beyond all question the filthiest thing I have ever read. The writer had really exceeded his master in obscenity, impossible as that might seem. The purport of it all was a kind of nightmare vision of the school, the masters, and the boys. Everybody and everything was distorted in the most horrible manner, seen, we might say, through an abominable glass, and yet every feature was easily recognizable. It reminded me of Swift's disgusting description of the Yahoos, over which one may shudder and grow sick, but which one cannot affect to misunderstand. There was a fantastic episode which I remember especially. One of us, an ambitious man, who for some reason or other had become unpopular with a few of his colleagues, was described as endeavoring to climb the school clock tower, on the top of which a certain object was said to be placed. The object was defended, so the writer affirmed, by the dark birds of night, who resisted the master's approach in all possible and impossible manners. Even to indicate the way in which this extraordinary theme was treated would be utterly out of the question, but I shall never forget the description of the master's face, turned up towards the object of his quest, as he painfully climbed the wall. I have never read, even in the most filthy pages of Rabelais, or in the savagest passages of Swift, anything which approached the revolting cruelty of those few lines. They were compounded of hellfire and cloaca maxima. I read out and translated a few of the least abominable sentences. I can hardly say whether the feeling of disgust or that of bewilderment predominated amongst us. One of my colleagues stopped me and said they had heard enough. We stared at one another in silence. The astounding ability, ferocity, and obscenity of the whole thing left us quite dumbfounded. And I remember saying that if a volcano were suddenly to belch forth volumes of flame and filth in the middle of the playing fields, I should scarcely be more astonished. And all this was the work of N, whose brilliant abilities in games and in the schools were to have been worth many thousands a year to X, as one of us put it. This was the boy that for the last 4 years we had considered as a great example of the formative influences of the school. This was the N who we thought would have died for the honor of the school, who spoke as if he could never do enough to repay what X had done for him. As I say, we looked at one another with faces of blank amazement and horror. At last, somebody said that N must have gone mad, and we tried to believe that it was so, for madness, awful calamity as it was, would be more endurable than sanity under such circumstances as these. I need scarcely say that this charitable hypothesis turned out to be quite unfounded. N was perfectly sane. He was simply revenging himself for the suppression of his true feelings for the last 4 years of his school life. The conversion on which we prided ourselves had been an utter sham. The whole of his life had been an elaborately organized hypocrisy, maintained with unfailing and unflinching skill, term after term, and year after year. One cannot help wondering when one considers the inner life of this unhappy fellow. Every morning, I suppose, he woke up with curses in his soul. He smiled at us all and joined in the games with black rage devouring him. So far as one can say, he was quite sincere in his concealed opinions at all events. The hatred, loathing, and contempt of the whole system, of the place, displayed in that extraordinary and terrible document, struck me as quite genuine. And while I was reading it, I could not help thinking of his eager, enthusiastic face as he joined with a will in the school songs. He seemed to inspire all the boys about him with something of his own energy and devotion. The apparition was a shocking one. I felt that, for a moment, I had caught a glimpse of a region that was very like hell itself. I remember that the French master contributed a characteristic touch of his own. Of course, the headmaster had to be told of the matter, and it was arranged that M and myself should collaborate in the unpleasant task of making a translation. M read the horrible stuff through with an expression on his face that, to my astonishment, bordered on admiration, and when he laid down the paper, he said, "Eh bien, Maître François est encore en vie avec des mots. C'est le frère rendez-vous de la Renaissance. De la Renaissance entre mauvais humeur, si vous voulez, mais de la Renaissance tout de même. Si, c'est de la crue véritable chez vous azur. Mais notre bon N est un Rabelais, qui a habité une terre affreusement sèche." I really think that to the Frenchman the terrible moral aspect of the case was either entirely negligible or absolutely non-existent. He simply looked on N's detestable and filthy performance as a little masterpiece in a particular literary genre. Heaven knows, one does not want to be a Pharisee, but as I saw M grinning appreciatively over this dung-heap, I could not help feeling that the collapse of France before Germany offered no insoluble problem to the historian. There is little more to be said as to this extraordinary and most unpleasant affair. It was all hushed up as much as possible. No further attempts to discover N's whereabouts were made. It was some months before we heard by indirect means that the wretched fellow had abandoned the Balliol scholarship and the most brilliant prospects in life to attach himself to a company of greasy barnstormers, or dramatic artists, as I suppose they would be called nowadays. I believe that his subsequent career has been of a piece with these beginnings, but of that I desire to say nothing. The passage has been quoted merely in evidence of the great success with which Ambrose Merrick adapted himself to his environment at Lupton. Palmer, the writer, who was a very well-meaning, though intensely stupid person, has told the bare facts as he saw them accurately enough. It need not be said that his inferences and deductions from the facts are invariably ridiculous. He was a well-educated man, but in his heart of hearts he thought that Rabelais, Maria Monk, gay life in Paris and La Terre all came to much the same thing. Chapter 4. In an old notebook kept by Ambrose Merrick in those long past days, there are some curious entries which throw light on the extraordinary experiences that befell him during the period which poor Palmer has done his best to illustrate. The following is interesting. I told her she must not come again for a long time. She was astonished, and asked me why. Was I not fond of her? I said it was because I was so fond of her, that I was afraid that if I saw her often, I could not live. I should pass away in delight, because our bodies are not meant to live for long in the middle of white fire. I was lying on my bed, and she stood beside it. I looked up at her. The room was very dark and still. I could only just see her faintly, though she was so close to me that I could hear her breathing quite well. I thought of the white flowers that grew in the dark corners of the old garden at the Warren, by the great ilex tree. I used to go out on summer nights when the air was still and all the sky cloudy. One could hear the brook just a little, down beyond the watery meadow, and all the woods and hills were dim. One could not see the mountain at all, but I liked to stand by the wall and look into the darkest place, and in a little time those flowers would seem to grow out of the shadow. I could just see the white glimmer of them. She looked like the flowers to me, as I lay on the bed in my dark room. Sometimes I dream of wonderful things. It is just at the moment when one wakes up. One cannot say where one has been or what was so wonderful, but you know that you have lost everything in waking. For just that moment you knew everything and understood the stars and the hills and night and day and the woods and the old songs. They were all within you, and you were all light. But the light was music, and the music was violet wine in a great cup of gold, and the wine in the golden cup was the scent of a June night. I understood all this as she stood beside my bed in the dark and stretched out her hand and touched me on the breast. I knew a pool in an old grey wood a few miles from the Warren. I called it the Grey Wood because the trees were ancient oaks that they say must have grown there for 1,000 years, and they have grown bare and terrible. Most of them are all hollow inside, and some have only a few boughs left, and every year, they say, 1 leaf less grows on every bough. In all the books they are called the forester's oaks. If you stay under them, you feel as if the old times must have come again. Among these trees there was a great yew, far older than the oaks, and beneath it a dark and a shadowy pool. I have been for a long walk, nearly to the sea, and as I came back I passed this place, and, looking into the pool, there was the glint of the stars in the water. She knelt by my bed in the dark, and I could just see the glinting of her eyes as she looked at me, the stars and the shadowy water pool. I had never dreamed that there could be anything so wonderful in the whole world. My father had told me of many beautiful and holy and glorious things, of all the heavenly mysteries by which those who know live forever. All the things which the doctor and my uncle and the other silly clergymen in the chapel, a highly Rabelaisian phrase is omitted, because they don't really know anything at all about them, only their names, so they are like dogs and pigs and asses who have somehow found their way into a beautiful room, full of precious and delicate treasures. These things my father told me of long ago, of the great mystery of the offering. And I have learned the wonders of the old venerable saints that once were marvels in our land, as the Welsh poem says, and of all the great works that shone around their feet as they went upon the mountains, and sought the deserts of ocean. I have seen their marks and writings cut on the edges of the rocks. I know where Sagromnus lies buried in the Wald Morgan, and I shall not forget how I saw the blessed cup of Tylo Agios drawn out from golden veils on Mynydd Mawr, when the stars poured out of the jewel, and I saw the sea of the saints and the spiritual things in Cor-arbennic. My father read out to me all the histories of Tylo, Dewi, and Ichtid, of their marvelous chalices and altars of paradise, from which they made the books of the Grail afterwards. And all these things are beautiful to me. But, as the anointed bard said, with the bodily lips I receive the drink of mortal vineyards, with spiritual understanding wine from the garths of the undying. May Michangel intercede for me that these may be mingled in one cup. Let the door between body and soul be thrown open, for in that day earth will have become paradise, and the secret sayings of the bards shall be verified. I always knew what this meant, though my father told me that many people thought it obscure, or rather, nonsense. But it is just the same, really, as another poem by the same bard, where he says, "My sin was found out, and when the old woman on the bridge pointed at me, I was ashamed. I was deeply grieved when the boys shouted rebukes as I went from Caer-Newydd. How is it that I was not ashamed before the finger of the Almighty? I did not suffer agony at the rebuke of the Most High. The fist of Hrisfoar is more dreadful to me than the hand of God." He means, I think, that our great loss is that we separate what is one and make it two. And then, having done so, we make the less real into the more real, as if we thought the glass made to hold wine more important than the wine it holds. And this is what I had felt, for it was only twice that I had known wonders in my body, when I saw the cup of Tylo Sant, and when the mountains appeared in vision. And so, as the bard says, the door is shut. The life of bodily things is hard, just as the wine-glass is hard. We can touch it and feel it and see it always before us. The wine is drunk and forgotten. It cannot be held. I believe the air about us is just as substantial as a mountain or a cathedral, but unless we remind ourselves, we think of the air as nothing. It is not hard. But now I was in paradise, for body and soul were molten in one fire and went up in one flame. The mortal and the immortal vines were made one. Through the joy of the body I possessed the joy of the spirit, and it was so strange to think that all this was through a woman. Through a woman I had seen dozens of times, and had thought nothing of, except that she was pleasant-looking, and that the color of her hair, like copper, was very beautiful. I cannot understand it. I cannot feel that she is really Nelly Foran, who opens the door and waits at table, for she is a miracle. How I should have wondered once if I had seen a stone by the roadside become a jewel of fire and glory. But if that were to happen, it would not be so strange as what happened to me. I cannot see now the black dress and the servant's cap and apron. I see the wonderful, beautiful body shining through the darkness of my room, the glimmering of the white flower in the dark, the stars in the forest pool. O gift of the everlasting, O wonderful and hidden mystery, many secrets have been vouchsafed to me. I have been long acquainted with the wisdom of the trees. Ash and oak and elm have communicated to me from my boyhood. The birch and the hazel and all the trees of the green wood have not been dumb. There is a cauldron rimmed with pearls, of whose gifts I am not ignorant. I will speak little of it. Its treasures are known to bards. Many went on the search of Caer-Pedryfan. 7 alone returned with Arthur, but my spirit was present. 7 are the apple trees in a beautiful orchard. I have eaten of their fruit, which is not bestowed on Saxons. I am not ignorant of a head which is glorious and venerable. It made perpetual entertainment for the warriors. Their joys would have been immortal. If they had not opened the door of the south, they could have feasted forever, listening to the song of the fairy birds of Rhiannon. Let not anyone instruct me concerning the glassy isle. In the garments of the saints who returned from it were rich odors of paradise. All this I knew, and yet my knowledge was ignorance. For one day, as I walked in Caer-rhiu, in the principal forest of Gwent, I saw golden Machen as she bathed in the brook Caer-rhiu. Her hair flowed about her. Arthur's crown had dissolved into a shining mist. I gazed into her blue eyes, as it were into twin heavens. All the parts of her body were adornments and miracles. O gift of the everlasting! O wonderful and hidden mystery! When I embraced Machen, a moment became immortality. And yet I dare say this golden Machen was what people call a common girl. And perhaps she did rough, hard work, and nobody thought anything of her till the bard found her bathing in the brook of Caer-rhiu. The birds in the wood said, when they saw the nightingale, "This is a contemptible stranger." June 24th. Since I wrote last in this book, the summer has come. This morning I woke up very early, and even in this horrible place, the air was pure and bright as the sun rose up, and the long beams shone on the cedar outside the window. She came to me by the way they think is locked and fastened, and just as the world is white and gold at the dawn, so was she. A blackbird began to sing beneath the window. I think it came from afar, for it sang to me of morning on the mountain, and the woods are still, and a little bright brook rushing down the hillside between dark green alders, and air that must be blown from heaven. There is a bird that sings in the valley of the Soar. Dewi and Tegfeth and Cubby preside over that region. Sweet is the valley, sweet the sound of its waters. There is a bird that sings in the valley of the Soar. Its voice is golden, like the ringing of the saints' bells. Sweet is the valley, echoing with melodies. There is a bird that sings in the valley of the Soar. Tegfeth in the south won red martyrdom. Her song is heard in the perpetual choirs of heaven. There is a bird that sings in the valley of the Soar. Dewi in the west had an altar from paradise. He taught the valleys of Britain to resound with Alleluia. There is a bird that sings in the valley of the Soar. Cubby in the north was the teacher of princes. Through him Edlogan sings praise to heaven. There is a bird that sings in the valley of the Soar. When shall I hear again the notes of its melody? When shall I behold once more Gladys in that valley? When I think of what I know of the wonders of darkness and the wonders of dawn, I cannot help believing that I have found something which all the world has lost. I have heard some of the fellows talking about women. Their words and their stories are filthy and nonsense, too. One would think that if monkeys and pigs could talk about their she-monkeys and sows, it would be just like that. I might have thought that, being only boys, they knew nothing about it, and were only making up nasty silly tales out of their nasty silly minds. But I have heard the poor women in the town screaming and scolding at their men, and the men swearing back. And when they think they are making love, it is the most horrible of all. And it is not only the boys and the poor people. There are the masters and their wives. Everybody knows that the Challeys and the Redburns fight like cats, as they say, and that the head's daughter was put up for auction and bought by the rich manufacturer from Birmingham. A horrible fat beast, more than twice her age, with eyes like pigs. They called it a splendid match. So I began to wonder whether perhaps there are very few people in the world who know, whether the real secret is lost like the great city that was drowned in the sea, and only seen by one or two. Perhaps it is more like those shining isles that the saints sought for, where the deep apple orchards are, and all the delights of paradise. But you had to give up everything and get into a boat without oar or sails if you wanted to find Avalon or the glassy isle. And sometimes the saints could stand on the rocks and see those islands far away in the midst of the sea, and smell the sweet odors, and hear the bells ringing for the feast, when other people could see and hear nothing at all. I often think now how strange it would be if it were found out that nearly everybody is like those who stood on the rocks and could only see the waves tossing and stretching far away, and the blue sky and the mist in the distance. I mean, if it turned out that we have all been in the wrong about everything, that we live in a world of the most wonderful treasures which we see all about us, but we don't understand, and kick the jewels into the dirt, and use the chalices for slop pails, and make the holy vestments into dishcloths, while we worship a great beast, a monster with the head of a monkey, the body of a pig, and the hind legs of a goat, with swarming lice crawling all over it. Suppose that the people that they speak of now as superstitious and half-savages should turn out to be in the right, and very wise, while we are all wrong and great fools. It would be something like the man who lived in the bright palace. The palace had 101 doors. 100 of them opened into gardens of delight, pleasure houses, beautiful bowers, wonderful countries, fairy seas, caves of gold and hills of diamonds, into all the most splendid places. But one door led into a cesspool, and that was the only door that the man ever opened. It may be that his sons and his grandsons have been opening that one door ever since, till they have forgotten that there are any others, so if anyone dares to speak of the ways of the Garden of Delight or the Hills of Gold, he is called a madman or a very wicked person. July 15th. The other day a very strange thing happened. I had gone for a short walk out of the town before dinner on the Dunham Road, and came as far as the four ways where the roads cross. It is rather pretty for Lupton just there. There is a plot of grass with a big old elm tree in the middle of it, and around the tree is a rough sort of seat, where tramps and such people are often seen resting. As I came along, I heard some sort of music coming from the direction of the tree. It was like fairies dancing, and then there were strange, solemn notes like the priests singing, and a choir answered in a deep, rolling swell of sound, and the fairies danced again. And I thought somehow of a great church high on the cliff above a singing sea, and the fair people outside dancing on the close turf, while the service was going on all the while. As I came nearer, I heard the sea waves, and the wind, and the cry of the seagulls, and again the high, wonderful chanting, as if the fairies and the rocks and the waves and the wild birds were all subject to that which was being done within the church. I wondered what it could be, and then I saw there was an old ragged man sitting on the seat under the tree, playing the fiddle all to himself, and rocking from side to side. He stopped directly he saw me, and said, "Ah, now, would your young honour do yourself the pleasure of giving the poor old fiddler a penny, or maybe two, for Lupton is a very hell of a town altogether, and when I play to dirty rogues, the reel of the warriors, they ask for something about 2 Obadiahs, the devil's black curse be on them, and it's but dry work playing for the leaf and the green sod. The blessing of the holy saints be on your honour now, this day and for ever. 'Tis but a scarcity of beer that I have tasted for a long day, I assure your honour." I had given him a shilling because I thought his music so wonderful. He looked at me steadily as he finished talking, and his face changed. I thought he was frightened, he stared so oddly. I asked him if he was ill. "May I be forgiven," he said, speaking quite gravely, without that wheedling way he had when he first spoke. "May I be forgiven for talking so to one like yourself. For this day I have begged money from one that is to gain red martyrdom, and indeed that is yourself." He took off his battered hat and crossed himself, and I stared at him. I was so amazed at what he said. He picked up his fiddle and sang, May you remember me in the time of your glory." He walked quickly off, going away from Lupton, and I lost sight of him at the turn of the road. I suppose he was half crazy, but he played wonderfully.